Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. And yes, as Hazel said, we're going to take a bit of a whistle-stop tour through 200 years of dinosaur research. Why 200 years exactly? Well, it's the 200-year anniversary since the first dinosaur was officially named. So it was being officially described and given a name properly. It was this dinosaur, or this part of a dinosaur. So what you see here, this is part of a tip of a lower jaw. The front here, this is where we would have the equivalent to the chin and a few teeth sticking out. So this was first found sometime in the 1790s, just before 1800, but it took a while to get described. It was found not too far away from here, actually, about 50 kilometers from Birmingham in a little quarry in Oxfordshire, 12 meters below ground, and a slate quarry where it was discovered. And it took about 30 years to be recognized and then officially being described by this person here, William Buckland. And he described that first at a Geological Society meeting as a new find of something spectacular. Spectacular in the sense that this was a new fossil of a reptile-like animal, but quite large, larger than anything that has been seen at the time. That fragment of the lower jaw is about 20-25 centimeters in length. So quite large, but it bears a resemblance to modern lizards. So it seemed to be a giant lizard, and Buckland described and introduced that new fossil, which he named Megalosaurus, the giant lizard, literally at that meeting. Below we see a painting or an illustration really of the same jaw, which was made by Mary Morland, later Mary Buckland, who was a fossil collector in her own right and illustrator. She illustrated quite a lot of Buckland's findings and descriptive work as well. So this find, quite unusual. As I said, it was considered to be a giant lizard, something like that in the early reconstructions. You can only see few bits of the bones which are preserved, so bits of the jaw not coming out very clearly here. And then we have a rib and a few vertebrae, the pelvic region, one of the femurs. So not too much preserved, but it was enough to indicate that this was some new fossil species, and that was the perception of what it looked like at that time. It also inspires the famous Crystal Palace dinosaur. So this is the same Megalosaurus depicted as a 3D statue, also from the 1850s. It's very clear that this looks like a big, scaly lizard, something that would live in a swamp or swampy environment. So something very sluggish. Lots of scales on it, walking on all 4 feet. Some other contemporaneous reconstructions have it here in combat with some other dinosaur. We'll get to that dinosaur in a minute. So yes, something that appeared around that time, this perception that this was really some quadrupedal lizard-like animal. And it took another 50 years until it was recognized that this probably walked on 2 legs rather than all 4. And this is a reconstruction from the late 1800s. So quite kangaroo-like, if you will, but at least upright, walking in 2 legs, which is much more closer to the modern knowledge of how Megalosaurus looked like. Life reconstruction of the same animal shown here feeding on a small mammal by the looks of it. But again, something that would be reminiscent of something more of a modern sauropod or prosauropod rather than a theropod dinosaur as we know now. And it took another 50 years to get closer to a perception of what this animal looked like. That's closer to today's knowledge. So again, walking at least on 2 legs on the hind limbs, the front limbs fairly short, with this massive neck and head region, a lot shorter than previously reconstructed, and the body held quite horizontally. Not the most up-to-date one. We have a newer reconstruction from the early 90s, which is a lot of artistic license. Also, the color pattern is a bit unique. But what we assume Megalosaurus may have looked like today based on the preserved remains, and this is what actually is preserved, but we can reconstruct the full skeleton as far as possible. So similar body posture, the body held quite horizontally, the longer hind limbs, the shorter forelimbs, and this is the most up-to-date reconstruction. This was done by paleoartist Andy Fraser, who did that specifically for our exhibition. This shows quite a modern animal, really. So compared to the swampy and sluggish lizard-like quadrupedal animal, we have a bit of fur or fluff, feathery fluff here on the back. What this is all about, we'll cover that later in the talk. And it was just a year later in 1825 when the next dinosaur was given a name. Again, this one has been discovered earlier. So these were by far not the earliest dinosaurs to be discovered, but officially and scientifically to be named. So that makes them official and scientific record. This dinosaur had, well, what the remains offered, teeth that were reminiscent of modern iguanas. We had a few other remains, and quite peculiarly, this little spike. And the paleontologist describing it, Gideon Mantell, thought because it looks from its teeth like a lizard, it must have been some kind of lizard-like creature. The teeth were reminiscent, that's why it's called iguanodon or iguana tooth. And that spike-like structure here he put as a nose horn at the tip of the snout. A bit outlandish from a modern perspective, but if we look at modern lizards, chameleons, similar taxa, we know they have similar headgear, similar spikes adorning the head. So this is not something too strange, but if we see the later reconstructions, it has quite a different impact. So again, that influenced the Crystal Palace statues. Again, something very scaly. If this was in the swamp, we wouldn't be too surprised. So something really sluggish, not very active. The typical depiction of dinosaurs in the 1800s and 1900s, really. Again, iguanodon. So this mystery dinosaur here in combat with Megalosaurus, that's identifiable by its nose horn. That's iguanodon. So both apparently carnivorous dinosaurs which are fighting for death here. But it took a few more years to recognize and further fossil finds that that particular horn on the nose is actually not a nose horn, but it's a thumb spike. So it's sitting on the first or fifth finger, depending how you count, as a spike, possibly for defensive purposes. And the respective reconstructions then show that exactly here on the hands, especially those two, which seem to be quite in a hurry to get away from something. So again, we change from a quadrupedal animal to a bipedal animal, something that looks more active, and a modern reconstruction of iguanodon would look like this. Possibly quadrupedals, so walking on all fours, but being able to walk on two legs, the two hind limbs, if necessary. The color pattern's quite unusual compared to the original reconstructions. So if we compare that to the respective original ideas, how these two dinosaurs looks like, then we get quite a different picture of what originally was proposed, how these live reconstructions may have looked like, and the modern view. Question is, how do we get from a few preserved remains, and this skeletal diagram of Megalosaurus is quite idealized because what we actually have is just this. So how do we get from a few bones, a few teeth that have been preserved over millions of years to something that is much more complete? How can we reconstruct a live reconstruction of these dinosaurs? And what has been done in the last 200 years so that we can bridge that gap in knowledge from our first described dinosaur to the most recent reconstruction? So one thing obviously we need is further material, and we have that. Over the last 200 years, about 700 new dinosaur species were discovered. That's about 3 dinosaurs per year. By now, the rate of discovery, or at least the rate of naming new species, is about 1 new dinosaur species per month. So quite a lot of effort goes into this. And if you think dinosaurs are just restricted to North America and the Badlands where they are cropping out, then that's wrong. So on the British Isles alone, we have about 50 different species of dinosaurs. So quite a wealth here. And that wealth of dinosaurs here locally, but also globally, that helps us piece different information back together. So of course, we only have what is preserved. That is in most cases very fragmentary. We have to imagine this is at least 66 million years since these animals lived, in many cases a lot longer. So over these millions of years, lots of material has been lost, has been taphonomically altered, so meaning distorted, deformed, fragmented. So how do we get from this to a more complete picture? Obviously, we can pool the information we have from different species, from different specimens. Some are more complete, some are less complete. We can piece that together, even though there are different species. Some of the skeletal bones are fairly conservative in their morphology, so they don't change too much. So we can interpolate from what we have for other species if we want to complement the missing information for our particular species, in this case, be it Megalosaurus. That doesn't help always. Sometimes we have quite strange and unique fossils preserved. In this case, these 2 large arms, which were found in the Mongolian desert. Those of you who grew up in the 80s and 90s with dinosaur books may remember that those 2 arms were only depicted of that species, and no one knew what this was really all about. And it took until 10 years ago, to get a more complete picture. So these 2 individuals of a dinosaur called Deinocheirus, and you see that these 2 individuals have different states of completion, but together we can pool that information and complement a full skeletal reconstruction. And based on that, we can reconstruct the whole animal. In this case, fairly unique and strange theropod dinosaur, but a herbivorous theropod, probably feathered, and it looks like a mix of a giant T-Rex and a giant duck. So something very unique, which we couldn't necessarily just get from the preserved arms. So sometimes we need more information and cannot just fill in the blanks with other specimens or other species. Nevertheless, even if we have found fairly complete dinosaur, it's never in a state that is completely untouched. It never resembles the condition it was in when it was still alive. So we have a lot of fragmentation of the different bones. They are deformed, they are distorted. Possibly they have been distributed by other animals, by wind and weather. So how do we piece them back together? How do we get those back into a state that we can recognize this as a complete animal? And even if we have complete skulls, articulated material, which is still in place, preserved, you can see that this is still not complete. We have different bits here on the left side of the snout missing. Some of these bones here have been turned upside down. The back of the skull is very much distorted, so the left and the right side don't look very much alike. So we need to piece that back together. Essentially what we have is a little jigsaw puzzle or little playset where we try to piece together that information to bring it back to a state what we think the animal looked like when it was alive. Previously, this has been done obviously with manual efforts, but getting towards the 21st century, we can use quite a lot of computational help here, and we can work in a digital realm rather than just in a physical realm. Main thing we need to do, obviously, first is to bring our physical fossil, our physical object into a digital format. Mostly we can use computer tomography or CT scanning for that. If you have been unlucky to break a bone or something, then you may have encountered CT scanning firsthand in a hospital. We can do something similar with our fossil bones and use X-ray technology to get an internal view of our dinosaur skull in this case, but it also allows us to put that skull back together to get a 3D representation, a 3D model of the overall skull or of the overall object, so that we can work with that in a digital world. That works quite well. As you can see, it's a very accurate representation of our fossil, accurate also in the sense that it carries on to have all its deformation, all its small breaks, cracks, fractures, so we need to remove those. But in a digital realm, this is a lot easier. So I can take individual specimens apart, I can look at individual elements, this one here highlighted in red. We see there are several large cracks running through that. We can see those cracks also in the corresponding CT scans. But what we can do is just fill in those cracks manually. So paint over them, fill them in so that they're becoming solid. We get a solid 3D model, and thereby we can quickly then fix these kind of imperfections. And this might seem really just for aesthetic purposes, and yes, to a large part it is. But if we imagine we want to do further analysis with that dinosaur, we want to do some computational modeling, some functional morphology or something like that, then obviously all these little cracks and breaks would create different results, most possibly wrong results. So we need to remove them and bring that dinosaur skull back to a condition as far to realism as possible. Other things we might see is that, yes, the nasal bone here, that part which runs between the orbit, between the eye here, and the nostril is missing on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side it's preserved. With digital technology, we can just extract that, quickly mirror it to the other side, then fit it into the skull, so supplement that. Possible with physical objects, but a lot more work. So in a physical approach, we would have to make a cast of the original fossil, then make a replica, take that apart, mirror it across, again, do a physical model. So a lot more difficult. In this case, ideally, with a few mouse clicks, I can quickly supplement the whole object very quickly. Same goes for objects or specimens that are not completely preserved. So this bone here, the lacrimal bone on the right-hand side, has only its top part preserved. But luckily, in vertebrates, we have bilateral symmetry. So most of the elements are present on the left and the right-hand side. On the left-hand side here, we have the lower part of that bone preserved. Can extract both of those, stitch them together, and get the complete specimen. And most of these examples were based on brittle deformation, so basically where we have cracks and parts getting loose and falling apart or falling away from the specimen, being displaced. But of course, over the course of many million years, we can also have very subtle deformation or plastic deformation, really, that the object itself is deformed, not broken, but deformed. We can see that here with this part of the skull of a Stegosaurus. This is the brain case region from a top view, and we see the left and the right side are not perfectly symmetrical. Again, we can use computer technology here in that we have the computer calculate the plane of symmetry in between that. And in a normal condition, if the object is bilaterally symmetrical, then the left and the right side would be the same. The plane of symmetry would be just one simple plane. In this case, we can see that is quite bendy, so not perfect, but we can use computer algorithm just to flatten that out. And by flattening that, we are also retrodeforming the overall object as well, so that we can make that perfectly symmetrical. The top one, that's as preserved. The bottom one, that's retrodeformed. So basically, that direction of deformation reversed so that we get the nice bilaterally symmetrical object again. And we can then use that to piece everything back together. So again, we have a large jigsaw puzzle, and we take all these different processes to fix and restore our fossils and then put them back together. What we'll end up with then is a nice skeletal reconstruction. So that's the basis then for further steps to then reconstruct dinosaurs. What we have so far, that's just the bones, but in a condition as far as to the lifelike condition as possible. So the next step, what we want to do is basically put some flesh on those bones to flesh the dinosaurs out in a literal sense. Again, this has been done with physical methods in the past, so using clay, plaster, similar materials to model, for example, the muscles around the skeleton. But you can imagine this is time intensive. Again, this requires a cast of the original object, a lot of manual effort to model those. Again, we can do that in a digital run. With muscles, particular, we know that muscles need to attach to two different parts of the skeleton. For example, for the jaw closing muscles in dinosaurs, we have 8 of those, 8 on each side, and they attach to very distinct regions of the skull. We know that from modern relatives of dinosaurs, birds, and on the one side, crocodilians on the other side. Between those, that muscle arrangement is fairly consistent, so we can assume as the simplest reconstruction that in dinosaurs we have a similar condition, and we can map those muscle attachment sites, how they would correspond in the skull and the lower jaw, connect them here by simple connectors at first, and then flesh those out into digital muscles. And that has the advantage that obviously I can take cross sections, look at different parts of the muscles, peel away parts of the skull, so I get to reveal the different muscles, can see their arrangement, can calculate volumes, cross-section areas. That helps me to understand how much muscle force could be produced. Some aesthetically very nice examples. This is work by my former PhD student, Luke Mead. He did a very nice job here with reconstructing those jaw muscles so that we can put, as I said, flesh on these bones and get more information. That works for other parts of the skeleton as well. Here are some examples for the neck muscles in different theropod dinosaurs. And in this case, we have some limb musculature, and also the tail muscles have been modeled with a very similar approach here for a big sauropod, so a brachiosaur, one of the larger sauropods. So we can then use this approach to flesh out our dinosaurs. So we have the skeleton, we have the muscles. Those are also interesting because they're providing the driving force for all biological activities. So if we know the muscle forces, we can model different skeletal models. We can do computer simulations to find out how hard these dinosaurs could bite or similar. Can also use those then to flesh out the overall body shape of dinosaurs or any other fossil object really. So what I'm showing is not just applicable to dinosaurs, but more broadly to other vertebrate animals as well, both fossil and modern. And we can use a similar computer modeling approach, basically wrapping our dinosaur model with the muscles possibly into a single surface to get an idea about their body shape. We can do various variations on the right-hand side here, variations for the body shape of Stegosaurus, a bit more generous, less generous, depending on what I think the different parameters might look like, and can test then different body shapes. And body shapes also allow me to calculate body mass, which is quite interesting for animals which are a lot larger than things we might see today. So we might be interested, how large could sauropod dinosaurs get? And we get to body masses of 20, 30, 40 tons, for example. So how could they function physiologically? How could they walk? These kind of things. They are also all based on these kind of functional properties. So now we have fleshed out our dinosaur. We know roughly the body shape. What we now want to do to put on some texture. Texture in the sense of dinosaurs, so dinosaur skin or possibly feathers. And we do have some examples of preserved dinosaur skin. So mostly these are examples from ornithopod dinosaurs. On the top right here, that's the famous dinosaur mummy called Dakota from North America. These show very nice preservation of, well, what we typically would expect of dinosaur skin to look like, very scaly, very reptile-like. So something we can then use to implement into our life reconstructions. But that's not all we have in terms of surface structures in the widest sense. Not just skin, but we have things that look like feathery structures, filaments, look a bit fur-like, but are actually not fur. Those are the precursors of modern feathers. So in that dinosaur here along the neck, both on the top and the bottom, and this little ceratopsian dinosaur here along the tail, these little bristles which are sticking out. Other dinosaurs, we have a bit more feathery or filamentous coverage here in that little dinosaur all along the tail, or we even get proper feathers in that one here on the right hand side. So this is really reminiscent of modern birds, and in some dinosaurs the feathers are not far off from modern birds. So there are different stages from these very bristle-like filamentous structures towards modern feathers, and we saw all gradients in between. Interestingly, we also find some evidence, not just if we have really spectacular preservation, but also some evidence on the bones. So this is a fallen bone of a velociraptor, and zoomed in, you see there are little indentations along the surface. We see similar indentations also on the bones of modern birds, in this case a turkey vulture. So these are so-called feather quill knobs. This is where the feathers attach through the skin and leave imprints or attachments on the bone, and we can see them. So we clearly know, based on that, that Velociraptor may have had some feathers, very different, obviously, to modern Hollywood reconstructions as this one here. So that gives us then a lot to work with. So our Megalosaurus, we know now its skeleton, we know its rough body shape, we can get an idea where it had scaly skin, where it may have had a lot of these filamentous, feathery-like structures. One thing that is always a bit contentious is color. Obviously, with paleo art, we can go wild with coloration. We can give it a more bright coloration or something more muted. Classical coloration for dinosaurs, obviously gray, greenish, brownish, so that it fits with everything living in a swamp, as the original perception was. But if we look at modern birds, the closest relatives to dinosaurs, we see a whole range of different colorations. So it would be nice to get an idea about what colors dinosaurs had. And this is something where we walk a very, very narrow ridge between speculation and actual science. So we can get some information for dinosaur coloration. And this is based on how colors work, which is really neat to extract. So colors are based on pigments, and these pigments are within smaller molecules, so-called melanosomes. And based on the color, these show the melanosomes are different shape. So everything towards a more reddish, rusty color has melanosomes that are spherical. Those that are towards the black range are more elongated and stick-like, and in between we have all kinds of gradients. So we can, based on the shape of these melanosomes, make inferences of what the color was that the object with these melanosomes had. Also quite interesting that some of the iridescent colors we see are not actually based on pigments, but these are so-called structural colors. So these are based on the surface texture of our object. Basically, we have little ridges and valleys, and in between those light is broken into the different spectral colors, and that gives us the iridescent coloration. This works similar to a CD. If you look at it in a different light angle, then that breaks the light as well. That works also in feathers and various other skin or other surface textures in animals. So we can use that approach if we can extract these melanosomes or these structural colors from a fossil to reconstruct the coloration. So shown in this feather here, where we have at different stages these very elongate melanosomes, indicating that this feather would have been black at these parts. And we can use that for various fossils if they are well enough preserved to have some of these melanosomes preserved as well. This little dinosaur, which I showed earlier, so I can already guess a bit on the structure here of how the tail filaments are orientated, that this may have been striped, and the melanosomes actually give an alternating pattern between lighter colors and darker colors. Also, some of the colorations around the head and the belly, that is a typical counter shading, so that we have the underside lighter than the dorsal side or the top side. So this is typically something to camouflage animals, but we'll get to that in a minute. Can do this with all kinds of feathers or skin preservation. And this little dinosaur here, we have an alternating pattern of white and black and some very bright reddish rusty colors here along the head feathers. So that can be reconstructed. That little ceratopsin, which I showed earlier with the little bristles along its tail, it has also a lot of skin preserved, and that skin gave us a lot of information about the color pattern. So we had actually a physical model built in this case, which implemented all the different information from the different melanosomes into that model. And this is not only interesting for that we know what the dinosaur looked like, of course that is quite important, but also colors in animals obviously have a function. They're not just for aesthetic purposes, but they also play a role in camouflaging animals in interaction with members of the same species or with predators or prey. So clearly the interaction with the environment is important. So we built that model and we put that into a more lifelike environment. So this is our reconstruction. You can also see this is quite an outdated reconstruction of myself here. So we used that in different environments, in an open environment and in a bit more shaded environment. And based on that, we can see how light interacts with our little dinosaur model here. The top one, that creates a more even pattern, a more gradient between the light distribution, and the bottom one, that is very harsh in contrast. So that would make the animal stick out quite a lot. The lower side would be very bright, the top side very dark. That's already what the animal coloration is. So that would just reinforce that. That would not be very useful in that environment. The top one, that light pattern, that's more useful to camouflage the animal, and based on that we can infer that this little ceratopsin dinosaur probably lived in a more woody, closed environment, possibly so in the underbrush or something like that, so rather than in an open environment. So we can use that then really to reconstruct some of the behavior and color patterns. Behavior is a good prompt here. So far we've only reconstructed morphology, but can we actually know something more about behavior? That depends a lot, yes, on the interaction with the environment, interaction with other animals, sensory capabilities. Can we get that from dinosaurs that have been dead for more than 66 million years? Yes, we can actually. So again, we can use computer technology to peel away parts of the skull. And if we do that and look at the brain cavity, this is where the brain would have been located. The brain is enclosed by the so-called brain case, by several bones, which are very tightly wrapped around the brain. And that leaves basically an imprint of the brain on the bones, and we can then digitally fill in our brain cavity, make a digital cast or a so-called endocast of what the brain would look like to get an idea. And I appreciate that doesn't necessarily look like a brain or something you would think a brain looks like. Our perception of what a brain looks like is probably very much driven by the human brain, where you have this large forebrain region which overgrows everything else, this walnut-shaped structure with lots of crenulations. This forebrain is a bit more modest in dinosaurs, so this is this region here, these two spherical parts left and right in top view. This is the forebrain region. This is where intelligence, cognition, things like that are taking place. The structures here in front, that's the olfactory region, that's where the sense of smell is located. The rest of the locomotory functions and so on are in the hind and midbrain. And quite interesting, what we have is also here the inner ear. That inner ear can tell us something about the sense of hearing, how good hearing capabilities in dinosaurs were, and also the sense of balance. And we can do that also for all kinds of dinosaurs. So if we want to know a bit more how our Megalosaurus may have seen or perceived the world, we can go to a close relative. So this is the brain of a Tyrannosaurus. Again, the midbrain region a bit more modest, so probably not the highest cognitive capabilities. But if we look at that structure here, those olfactory tracts, that olfactory region, that sense of smell probably was very well developed. So if a prominent Hollywood paleontologist tells you, if you encounter a T-Rex, don't move, he can't see you, that might be true. It's probably not true, but even if it were true, I'm pretty sure he could smell you from several tens to 100 meters further away. So rather run away than wait for it to sniff you out and eat you. Along that line, again, something very prominently dinosaur intelligence, and some of dinosaurs may have been intelligent enough to open doors and use door handles according to some Hollywood law. Can we get an idea? Yes, we can get an idea about the intelligence of Velociraptor. We do actually have parts of the brain preserved, or the brain case preserved, and we can reconstruct parts of the brain itself. Unfortunately, the relevant region, that forebrain region, where intelligence and cognition reside, is not preserved, but we can look at related dinosaurs. So a lot of the smaller raptorial dinosaurs related to Velociraptor, but also close to modern birds, or where we have the transition to more modern birds, have a very distinct brain. So in this dinosaur here, we have the brain reconstructed. It looks very different to the brain of Tyrannosaurus, so not very elongated, but more spherical. We have this region here called the optic lobe, this bulb here, which is responsible for vision, so possibly a very good vision. The forebrain, quite well developed, and that spherical structure of the brain reminiscent of what we see more and more towards modern birds. So that transition where we go from the raptorial dinosaurs to modern birds, we see the spherical change of the brain. So that modern brain here of a modern pigeon. And based on that, we can estimate intelligence and cognition. We know that pigeons are very smart. They have image recognition capabilities. They can recognize people, things like that. With other bird groups, ravens, crows, parrots, we obviously have lots of different tool use, problem-solving capabilities, and so on. So we can assume that somewhere between those capabilities and a bit more modest ones in dinosaurs, we have a gradient of how intelligent dinosaurs were, but probably a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for. So best example, probably if you look in your garden and see a magpie, imagine a 10-meter magpie, then you know what a T-Rex would have acted and looked like more or less in behavior. One thing we would really like to reconstruct, and this is where we have barely any knowledge, but which is very prominently always, or we don't have any sound. Okay, so it doesn't work like that, but you obviously know what a T-Rex in Jurassic Park looks and sound like. That sound, that screeching sound. Any ideas what the movie makers used to make the T-Rex sounds? Yes, it's an elephant. So they used quite a range of different animals, alligators, which is okay, probably close enough to dinosaurs, both in terms of taxonomic relationship, but also in behavior. But anyway, if lions and tigers, obviously, yes, to get the loud roar. We have a baby elephant, so that characteristic T-Rex roar, that is from a baby elephant that has been then further modified. But we also have donkeys, whales, dolphins, mating koalas, and pneumatic drills and jackhammers. So quite a lot of different sounds, none of which are actually related to dinosaurs, maybe the alligator, but the rest is not very realistic. But can we actually get an idea what dinosaurs sounded like? We can reconstruct quite a lot of the other things. We can reconstruct the brain, things like that. What about sound? Well, the way sound is produced in humans, for example, is basically we have some kind of cartilage cage between the neck muscles, and in there we have the two vocal folds, and the vibration of the vocal folds and opening and closing makes sound, and that's why you can hear me talking. We don't have necessarily something like that in archosaurs, so neither in crocodiles nor in birds. Here we have slightly different arrangements. In crocodilians, we have the so-called larynx, so a large cartilage tube where we have the sound or vocalization capabilities or production happening. In birds, we have so-called syrinx, and this is actually a branching pattern. So we have two components to that structure. That means birds can create two sounds at the same time, meaning they can sing a duet with themselves. Somewhere in between, obviously, we have a range of different sounds. Crocodilians don't necessarily make a lot of sounds, where modern birds obviously have a repertoire of very different songs and so on. We know that somewhere along the line between dinosaurs and modern birds, that structure appeared. We know that from a duck-like fossil from the Cretaceous, so that already has some of the more advanced structure. From dinosaurs, we don't necessarily know very much because those structures are made of cartilage and they don't preserve, they don't fossilize very well. The only example we have is from this ankylosaur, where we have the larynx preserved, so this structure here right below the neck. That morphology is a bit between crocodilians here on the left side. It's not fully here at the stage that we see in modern birds, even more basal birds like ostriches or emus. So sound making capabilities probably somewhere in between ostriches and crocodilians. Hard to estimate what they were capable of. So probably not the whole repertoire we see in modern birds, but some low frequency sounds similar to crocodilians. But this is basically very conjectural. We don't have a lot of evidence here about what kind of sounds dinosaurs were making. So yeah, with that final conclusion, we know a lot of things about dinosaurs. We know several things we never thought we could find out 200 years ago. But there's still several things we probably never will find out. So the sound capabilities of dinosaurs is probably something that is really difficult to reconstruct. Overall, this was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I appreciate that. There's lots of things I could talk about in terms of dinosaur research. A lot of things have happened over the last 200 years, so we could fill a whole day, if not more, with that. But I think that gives you a good impression. If you want to get a bit more insight, as Hazel mentioned, we have our temporary exhibition in the Lapworth Museum, which covers some and other things shown here. So yeah, final thing left to do. Thanking you for your attention, and I'm sure we have some time for questions.